I'm not going to say a whole lot about Mike Dorrell. Most of you who are here know who he is. He's known as a playwright, but he also writes fiction. He writes poetry beautifully, and he has the most beautiful voice in the world. He has done Talking Whales 2 and Talking Whales as well, a short play, The Irrigation Murder. He's worked on part of Salt Lake Acting Company's Water Project, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We love to have him here because his voice is so beautiful and he writes these incredible stories and wonderful poems. They're so visceral, and his voice is nourishing for months and months afterwards. And that's enough to say about Mike Dorrell. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Joe, for that great introduction. Mainly tonight what I'm going to read is a section out of the middle of a novel called The House of the Raven's Wing. And The House of the Raven's Wing is a novel within a novel, and I disclaim authorship of the novel within the novel, because it's not written by me, but by a 1940s English novelist who I've invented called Vera Quest. But before I do that, I'm going to read a short poem in memory of my father, who died in January this year. And in fact, I think the last time I was reading, my father had not long died. And this one is it's a poem, and it's actually called Today. I would wait by rivers today, listening to the sound of stones, or walk deep in imaginary pools. I would discover the shape of things beyond the edge. I would reach out then into that place just out of reach, where the state of things beyond ourselves lies waiting, somehow always in the wet. I cannot say there are no poems in dry air, only that conspicuous fertility does not occur there, where the chiseled marks of the old stonecutters confirm their abandonment. I am aware, too, of granaries in the desert, but this is careful preparation with preserved facility. I am thinking of home, where my father may be dying quietly, of places of silence and water, where there is no guarantee of redemption. Thank you. And now, the middle section of the novel within the novel, written by Vera Quest, and round page 100 or so, the psychiatrist who has fallen in love with his patient, Marina Waters, and followed her to Cornwall, is lying in a hospital bed in a place called Trewerran, at the edge of Cornwall. And for those of you that know Cornwall, it is the place of standing stones, often called maidens par excellence. The title of The House of the Raven's Wing is taken from a place in London on the edge of Hampstead Heath, and it was renamed by Marina's father. And the central mystery of The House of the Raven's Wing is what happened to Marina during the terrible last days of her father's life, and what is the real secret, both practical and emblematical, if you like, or almost mythological, of The House of the Raven's Wing. And I should tell you that her father, who had an affair with the novelist Vera Quest, was an alchemist. So here is what is called the Tomlinson account. It's very different from things that I've read here before, perhaps less dramatic, more analytical perhaps. It's a different kind of prose. So here I go with the Tomlinson account. I will no longer attempt to deny it. I should never have let it happen, but it did. A doctor is not supposed to fall in love with his patient. particularly not if he's a therapist. There are no excuses for a lapse in professional behaviour. I should have been well prepared. My training told me everything was against it. And even when it first began, I tried to distance myself. I was extra careful with my behaviour, and I swear that I never prejudiced her treatment. I swear this, and at the same time, I fell for her eyes and her thin arms and her perceptions, which were shot through with a strange and terrible poetry. I remember the day when she was brought in. It was May, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There were buds on the sycamore trees near the hospital. There was a languid heat in the air. I'd been writing up case notes all day, and I was thinking of going home early, but I persuaded myself to stay. And then I met Marina Waters, as she was then. I have rarely seen such a state of withdrawal. It was not the depth, but rather the intensity that fascinated me. Her face was white, tear-stained. She was lying on the stretcher with her hair pushed back from her eyes, which were staring blankly in front of her. There was a slight flicker of movement which indicated that she knew what was going on, but she was somewhere else, locked in a reality of her own invention, or so I thought. Houseman did the preliminary diagnosis. It was a normal case of acute schizophrenia, he said, if that makes sense. It was brought about by the death of her father, and in his opinion, an unrealistic expectation of what the world had to offer. Houseman prescribed the usual course of treatment, sedatives, and a gradual introduction to the mild version of group therapy sessions that the hospital permitted. She wasn't expected to totally recover. In that respect, she was like so many others. But the background was unusually disturbing. Marina Waters, or Marina Kay, as she was better known, was famous, or had been. She'd taken her last name from a Kafka novel and had been photographed with Jimi Hendrix and the Pink Floyd. She was an icon who might have abused herself in more ways than one, and the family was puzzling. Her father, Rafe, had pursued esoteric researches, even magic, before he died. And Cecile, the aunt who brought her up, was a strange woman in her late 50s with a penchant for lavender twin sets and crime novels. Everything should have told me to be wary, to be ultra-professional. I swear that I was, but that didn't prevent me from being drawn in. For a while, I even sympathized with Cecile Waters as she described what she was convinced was a fatal and irredeemable flaw that ran through the whole family. But gradually, I realized that she was a person who only coped with difficult situations by denial. Cullen, I know that strictly you should not see this account, but I also feel that I owe you an explanation. My sudden reappearance in Cornwall after a gap of 10 years must have shocked you. The journey was a traumatic experience for me, as it must have been for Marina. And I don't deny the thought that you were here served as a sort of anchor. This is a strange admission for a therapist. Cullen, you are the anchor man now. 10 years since we camped near the old arsenic mine and watched the sun reflect on the maidens in the evening. 10 years since the gauze prickles came through the ground sheet and we made tea on that strange methylated spirit stove. I am not a sentimentalist. I went back to medical school and we parted when I chose a career and you went for a free-form existence on the periphery and you became the artist you always really were. And now, as I lie here in the Treweren hospital bed, I feel an overwhelming sense of the edges coming together, of a pattern emerging. It is strange how working in an institution prepares you for the flip side of that existence, life as a patient. As you know, I shall probably only be here for a short while, until they have checked me for concussion. The lacerations are already showing signs of healing. I could fit well with the schema here. I could even get to like it. I thought it could be broken, you know. That Marina's vision of herself as some potential Saint Sebastian waiting for the arrows of persecution to strike was a metaphor for her fear of reality. It is only lately that I've come to realize it is no metaphor at all. That the 60s were a terrifying time for her. That she broke out of seclusion into a world where no holds were barred, and then she had to retreat from that back into that house, which is dominated by her father's obsessions. Yes, I felt all the liberal things about her, that she could be reached by a combination of sympathy and a gentle opening out to normality, that the fear could be subdued by explanation, rationalized, brought into the light by a series of gentle probes. And of course, she was beautiful. It's not that I haven't looked at other women in the 10 years since we separated. Of course I have. There have been affairs, naturally enough. But since you, no one has touched me quite in that way. No one has reverberated through my senses and made me make a different account of myself. 10 years ago, if you remember, you told me that I was being too rigid, that I was trying to run my life along a series of tram lines. You were right, only not in the way you meant. You implied rigidity in my way of thinking, but it was not an imposed grid, as you thought. No, it was only a lack of awareness. I'm paying for it now. I'm open to the heart, and I do not quite know what to do with it. Marina has touched some nerve in me, fascinated me with what she showed me of the world inside herself, a kind of cipher into an intensity that I have never experienced before. No, not even with you. Do you remember an evening in front of a tin miner's cottage on the north coast? It was a small two-room building with massive stone blocks at the corners, sagging wooden lintels and a stone flag floor. Do you remember how we briefly thought of renting it, never going back to London, to the world of assignments and the hierarchy of qualifications? You stayed in Cornwall, and I returned and I got my degree, and after that I became a therapist. You were right in what you said then. We could have done it together perhaps, because then we might have avoided what is happening now, which is both a curving back, a re-examination, and a going forward. That moment in that front of that place stayed with me for years as a kind of emblem of my own locked potential, if you like. It stayed with me as a reminder of my more flexible self, and it stayed until I met Marina. Before that, I thought of what happened between us as a kind of ultimate exchange of feeling. I really met Marina for the first time in the day room of Little Acres sometime after she'd been admitted. It was early morning, and the floor smelled of polish. She was sitting by herself on one of those metal stacking chairs with a green canvas back. The only other thing in the room was a heavy oak table with a specimen vase with a single rose on it. The rose was dead. "The vase sings," she said. Her voice was flat, without expression. The fact she'd spoken at all surprised me and made me much more hopeful that her condition was not as bad as Houseman had feared. She turned towards me with her hands clasped in front of her. "In a moment, it will break." I nodded in what I hoped was a reassuring way, and I walked across the room. I opened the curtains further. I took out my notebook and pen. When I turned back towards her once more, I became aware of a terrible concentration, of a straight line of communication between her and the vase that I could observe, but I could not change. It shocked me, but I was drawn in. I could not help myself. When the vase cracked into pieces, I could not believe it. I did not want to go beyond the rational. Even now, I can't be sure of what really happened. Did Marina somehow make the glass break? Or was she possessed of some sort of ability that enabled her to realize what was happening before anyone else could? I am not credited with possession of some sort of psychic force. That has been too overworked to be believable. But I do realize that while I'm lying here, that something in her background does enable her to break through the rigid sense barrier with which we usually surround ourselves. I do realize I'm talking about myself here. That your work proves that every day you're open to chance encounters. You're not closed in, Cullen, and that is why I am writing to you. I'm afraid for Marina. You must have realized by now, I'm afraid that the isolated situation in that black cottage with her injured husband is too near the one with her father that she escaped from less than a year ago. I'm going to skip a little bit now and do another bit a bit later on in the letters. And the letters really are a series of Tomlinson's attempt to work out and analyse the situation as best he can before he goes back to London. He has told Marina that he loves her and he knows it's hopeless. Her father was an alchemist. Is that a believable occupation in the late 20th century? I certainly could not take it seriously when Cecile, Marina's aunt, first informed me. It conjured up too many images of Aleister Crowley-type figures in cloaks. What have I to do with alchemists? Or alchemists to do with me? I thought it was dismissible. I thought I was dealing with some much more straightforward father-daughter conflict, if any of those can be called straightforward. But you know, I'm sure that I've always tended to believe Freud rather than Jung. It's sex over culture and religion for me, anytime, I'm afraid. I've seen the effects of possessive love in my own family. My brother, for instance, joined the army to escape my parents, was posted to Germany, and didn't come home for 10 years. But Rafe Waters was no ordinary father. He was older, for one thing, and he was richer. He was the first example of harm wrought by an unearned income that I've ever come across. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Decadence on the back of secure bonds in the bank. But it was complicated. Are you still following me? I think I'd better explain more. And the best way to do this is to give you some of the background information I copied into my case notes. I cannot and would not give you the notes themselves. You understand that? But sharing background material is hardly a breach of professional etiquette. Rafe Waters was born at the turn of the 20th century. The family had been middle-class entrepreneurs and had made a lot of money in the 1880s out of patent medicines. They were very popular then. One of them was called Dr. Loftus's Lift, and it had a lot of alcohol and more than a few traces of cocaine until that became illegal. Remember Beecham's pills? Well, it was that kind of thing that made their fortune. Rafe's father, Henry Waters, he was the one who really made the money, and he bought some land on the edge of Hampstead Heath where he built a house called Elsinore, a strange Gothic kind of residential castle that his son later renamed the House of the Raven's Wing and remodeled to suit his own arcane purposes. Anyway, back to Rafe Waters. Like his brother John, he was educated at a private school in Hampstead and later went to Oxford to study classics. Conventional enough, you might think. Every newly rich family could do with a Don to add to the pedigree. But Rafe refused to conform. First, he didn't finish his degree. He flunked out of Oxford after his first year, and then he wouldn't go into the family business. Instead, he went to live in Munich, and then in Paris. After that, the next 10 years read like a discontented version of the Grand Tour. Rome, Naples, Florence for a while, another spell in Paris, and even a brief stay in South America. Quite when and where he first became interested in the occult would be difficult to say. Certainly, by the time he was in his 30s, he was acquiring rare books with Latin titles like Aqua Regis, Kingswater, and Philosophum Materium, the philosophy of materials. He had the money to do this, and he indulged himself. He was definitely out of his time, our Rafe, and if I sound hard on him, I have to admit that I am, because of what happened to Marina. Because of the way he inflicted his obsessions upon her until they became part of her darker self. In the 1930s, when the world was dividing itself into armed camps and the radicals of his generation were donning cloth caps and stressing the advantages of a working class background, Rafe was unashamedly elitist. He lived a peculiar and rarefied life, delving into his researches and coming to the conclusion that the early history of his family was Celtic rather than Anglo-Saxon. A peculiar life. Even as I write this now, I was struck by his apparent indifference to the main current of events. Didn't the Spanish Civil War affect him? Didn't he read Auden or McNeice? Why was he indifferent to Orwell? But a man so peculiarly personalised could never have been a member of the Left Book Club. He was highly individuated, if I may steal a phrase from Jung. He followed his own researches with little regard to the consequences for anyone else. He polarised people. The Tribune group for people on the left found him of little consequence, and he was once referred to as full of antediluvian angst, terms I rather like and wish I'd thought of myself. But in the upper reaches of society, particularly amongst that strange subset of privileged bohemians that circled around the Bloomsbury group, Rafe was very popular, particularly among the women. He was rumoured to have a brief affair with Edith Sidwell. There's a photograph of him with Jean Rhys, and it might even have been in her company that he first met Vera Quest, the popular novelist. Didn't I tell you before? There's a strong possibility that Vera Quest is Marina's mother. There's a tinted photograph of them both, Ralph and Vera. I have a copy of it in Little Acre. He is greying, handsome in an imperious sort of way, wearing a heavy tweed suit with one hand on a knobbly walking stick and another clasping hers. Her hair is pulled back and up in one of those elaborate styles of the 1940s. She's wearing a walking outfit too, complete with a cotton anorak and an elaborate health scarf, and they are sitting on a headland somewhere. I swear it is Cornwall, and it could even be Trewarren. Despite the fact that it was taken during the war, there's a whiff of leisurely activity about them, of private pleasure. He was not her husband, though. He must have been her lover, and I definitely think she is Marina's mother. More about this later. But why am I doing this, you might ask? Am I obsessed by her, by them? By the peculiarity of an irresponsible life, at least on his part? Am I jealous because of my own lower middle class background and my salaried way of life? No. I don't think so. Something goes deeper here. To a realization that the life of some individuals, or particularly determined ones, can have far more effect than we'll easily admit. I don't mean the cliche of being in the right place at the right time either, but what appears to me now to be the wrong place and the wrong time. Not the least because of the disastrous effects on Marina. What was the connection between the older alchemist and the younger novelist? She could only have been 30-something then, despite her popularity. She is obviously drawn to him, and you can see it in the photograph. She is looking at him in a way which she gives herself totally. If I liked her novels more, I would say he was a very lucky man. Her books, yes, particularly the famous ones, like the Pendine Chronicles, are mostly historical tales, full of beautiful houses, struggling women, and occasional horror. They were popular enough in their day, but hardly anyone reads them now. Except me. I want to know the background. I want to know everything about Marina Waters that I can lay my hands on.